Thank you for joining me, Michael.
It's a great pleasure.
It is such a pleasure to be here in this project of yours. When I was coming here, several of my colleagues from the London office or from other offices who've come through London said, "Oh, just wait. You can't. When you see this building, you're gonna lose it." And I've been to the New York office a lot. It's by Pelly and Associates. It's quite a grand place, but working here this week, it really is something different. From the logic of the atrium that really brings the building together, I feel like I'm in a magical conch shell when I come to work. Tell me about the design brief. How did this project start?
Oh, well, first of all, there was no brief as such. So it was a fascinating project because I think partly the reason I came to it because I've never done an office building before. This is the first and only office building I've ever designed.
Really?
And there was a definite approach from Bloomberg, which was to challenge accepted practice in the terms of how to design a workplace. And for that reason, rather than have someone who had established ideas about how the office should work, they wanted someone who specifically had not done an office. So that's sort of how I, in broad terms, came to the project. And there was no brief as such. The brief came out of a conversation. So the first meeting I attended was in New York with Mike Bloomberg, and we just sat for a while. And out of that meeting came an A4 sheet of paper with 10 lines on it, and that became the brief. And it was that simple. And it was a little more than headlines, and it was objectives, things that we wanted to accomplish as part of the project. And then the whole process was iterative. So it was. What I would say is probably one of the best ways to design any building is a dialogue, a really constructive, collaborative dialogue between Bloomberg, the whole organization, Mike Bloomberg specifically, very specifically, and then to take what was being said and kind of begin to shape it into a brief as well as a building. So it emerged rather than being preconceived by a set of requirements.
When you say iterative, can you give me an example of one of the sustainability goals and how it drove a design feature within the building?
Well, so of the 10 line items on the sheet of paper, the one in capitals at the bottom, the biggest and largest, was sustainable. So that was a very, very clear objective right from the get-go about how to produce a building that was as sustainable as it could be. And I think the thing that's going back to this idea of iteration, where we've ended up is much better than we ever set out to accomplish, because as time progressed, as the building began to emerge, as technology and advances in innovation moved on, we were actually able to accomplish more than we could. So probably one of the biggest innovations was the introduction of natural ventilation into a huge deep plan building. I mean, when you go around later, you'll get the sense these are enormous floor plates, so to be able to ventilate them naturally was quite a challenge, and that was not something that was on the agenda at the beginning, but we put it out there and said, look, I think we should do this. And actually there was a lot of soul searching from everybody. At the end of the day, okay, let's do it. And so we set about completely trying to think about how best we could accomplish that in this form of building. So I'd say natural ventilation, but it was never intended to be naturally ventilated until we got to that point where, and interestingly, one of the points we made back then was it's about resilience. Buildings need to be really resilient for the future. And actually the biggest test was the pandemic, when the natural ventilation, because of the huge volumes of air going through this building, actually turned out to be incredibly resilient, because you could occupy it quite quickly again, because it was a much more highly ventilated building just by virtue of that. So I think we talked about sustainability in its broadest sense, not just energy, but about well-being and about people's comfort levels. And that's proved to also bring with it resilience and the ability for the building to shift and change and accommodate, certainly one of the most significant events in recent living memory. So these things emerged, but they were not right out there at the beginning. And Mike Bloomberg, I'd say, was probably the biggest driving force. He wanted to, one of the other words on there was innovate. I want you to innovate,
Right.
innovate, innovate. And he often said, I'd rather you beg for forgiveness than ask for permission. So just push, push, push. And I think the other big sort of obvious thing is that we have a timber floor through the whole building. And, that would never be done in an office until now.
Never done.
And there was we had a whole very tedious conversation about cabling and, all sorts of boring realities of life. And Mike just said, we'll figure it out. So we came up with this whole new system of, again, innovate, innovate. We came up with this whole system, which now you're beginning to see more broadly used. And it was having a client who was willing to challenge all of these accepted practices and the norm that I think was incredibly. You wouldn't see this building if it weren't for that mindset from Bloomberg.
I want to talk with you about the ventilation, because that's such a signature feature of so many Foster and Partners buildings that I personally have experienced. But the other thing first I want to say about them is that I feel like Foster's projects always have me looking up. And it's certainly the case in this building with the innovative ceiling. This is not something you pick up off the shelf. Tell me about how the design and the manufacture and the iteration to come up with this ceiling feature.
Well,
it's so striking from really inside and outside the building.
It was out of necessity. I'm a big, I bore on a lot with clients about the ceiling, because at night the ceiling is the elevation of the building. So for me it's a very, very critical element to any building. But for this particular building it was a necessity, because if you can imagine a beautiful hot summer's day and you're bringing air directly in from outside, naturally ventilating, if you had a regular chilled ceiling, it would hit the ceiling, condense, and you'd have condensation running everywhere. So we had to find a way to chill the ceiling, to chill the whole building using the ceiling, but try and mitigate the risks of condensation. So by necessity, we had to develop a whole new ceiling. And in amongst all of that, we were in the beginnings of the ability to have illuminated planes rather than linear elements in. So all sorts of things came together. And to Bloomberg's testament, a lot of what we did was untried, untested, and they actually went as far as building us a laboratory. Us in the broadest sense of the huge team it took to deliver this, building us a laboratory to test, prove, and really innovate on that level. So the ceiling is in fact incredibly simple. It seems obvious, but it took a long time to get there. And it's effectively a massive surface area of polished aluminium, which the cooling's coming through. The area means you don't chill it, you just cool it. So you're putting less energy in to get the same cooling out. The form of the petals deal with the acoustics that are required to deliver a timber floor. So you can see it's all very integrated. So that whole ceiling is basically facilitating a timber floor as well. And then the last component of it, which is again some of the formation of the petals, as they're known, the aluminium petals, is to deal with lighting. So each of these elements sort of was designed to accomplish a specific need and objective, but it came together in this very beautiful way. I think it's beautiful, but I think it's become quite a signature of the building. And technically it was a real challenge. And very few clients would invest the amount of R&D and the facilitation and the specialist expertise it took to do that. But without that, there would be no natural ventilation. Without that, the building wouldn't perform as it does environmentally. It would be using a huge amount more energy. So the ceiling is probably the single most sustainable element in the building. And I want to take issue with you on one thing you said.
Okay.
You described an atrium in the middle of the building, and that's the very thing we set out not to do.
Oh.
I think if Mike Bloomberg was sitting here, he would say, actually, he wanted not a big void in the middle of the building. He wanted it to be really purposeful. And he wanted people to move around the building. And again, it's part of a well-being agenda, but do it on foot. So the building's capped at 10 stories. It could have been 22 in places, but it's capped at 10 stories. And people move around on foot. And the ramp is deliberately designed and sized so that you feel able to pause for a moment, meet with someone who you've just bumped into you. We can stand there, we can have an exchange. And so I think in that sense, it's probably, I've heard it described as the biggest meeting room in the building. It's the place where people literally encounter each other, they move around. And that very much spoke to something that Bloomberg described, which was this idea of chance exchanges, chance interactions. Those are the things that are the backbone of the success of Bloomberg. And the building basically facilitates it. And that's, I think it's a little bit form follows function in that sense, but it's not an atrium.
Not an atrium. Very clear on this point now. For those of you in the audience, I want to point again to the QR code. I see a few questions have already come in, and I will be getting to those a little bit later in the chat, but you may continue to add them. I want to talk about the British Museum and the great canopy feature of that project. I think that they might be able to bring that up behind me. Maybe they already have. But I live in Washington, D.C., and we also have an incredible Foster and Partners
Smithsonian.
At the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery. And it is, this great glass canopy over a courtyard that has made it one of the great rooms in Washington. It can be, the kind of downpour that'll cancel a flight, and you can sit inside and have a coffee. So tell me about the project at the British Museum and how this concept kind of came about.
Well, so just to give a bit of context so that people understand, when I said I've never done an office building before, mostly what I worked on is civic buildings, like at the British Museum. And I think one of the things, there are lots of strands that run through all of these projects, but part of the British Museum was you used the word room in the middle. It was about creating a giant urban room for London. It was about sorting out and addressing various urban issues about paths between key streets in Bloomsbury, about creating a way through a urban context, about creating a centre of gravity for the museum. It sorts out all of the issues that people had previously, where effectively to move around the museum, you had to walk through all the galleries. And that was creating congestion, and it was really, making the experience in the galleries not very satisfactory. So again, a bunch of thinking. And the proposal we came up with was to remove all of the very, very low quality buildings that sit in there, clear out the space, cover it so it's a year-round space, and create what we would call a square for London. And it happened to have the old Smirk reading room in the middle of it, but that was a great asset as much as anything. And so it became a sort of a puzzle about creating urban realm on a much broader scale than just in the museum. So it's very much part of a route that takes you from the British Library up on the Euston Road, around down through Bloomsbury, right down as far as Trafalgar Square, which also we worked on at the time. We were doing the same thing about trying to take the traffic out of the north side of Trafalgar Square in front of the National Gallery. So these were it was all very joined, a bit like all the parts of this, but it was all kind of a bigger joined-up thinking that brought about this creation of what we think of as a public space for London as much as it is for the museum. So it's a very interesting. It's a very interesting challenge when it's not just about focusing on one thing. It's about having a much greater sense of awareness of the bigger picture in which it sits and being able to try and help shape that and address other issues that are at large that need thinking about.
For a project like that, where you have a lot of stakeholders involved, it is a key asset to the culture, the history of the city. How do you bring them on as clients? How do you build that trust so that you can do something very innovative and something untested?
Well, it's very much part of iterative process. It's very much part of listening and responding and trying to build consensus and trying to make sure that you're, in effect, not just presenting people with a done deal, that actually everyone feels that they are invested in what it's going to become. So there's no substitute, as I said, right from the beginning, there is no substitute for a conversation, a dialogue, a collaborative process, and that's whether that's within Bloomberg as an organisation, within London in terms of all of the statutory bodies that had an engagement with the British Museum. It doesn't really matter on what level it is, but this idea of having a collaborative endeavour, I think, is the key to achieving any of these things. If you any other way, I don't think it's possible. You have to bring people along with you, otherwise it becomes an impossible challenge, I would say. So dialogue, being available, being able to actually, I don't care where the best idea comes from. It can come from anywhere, as long as we have the best idea ultimately, collectively, at the end of the day. So, you know, I really think it's, people bring an overview or analysis, a contribution to a project, and they probably sometimes don't quite estimate what it's bought, but it sets about another train of thoughts. So who cares where the great idea comes from? And if you don't ask, you don't ever get a sense of what other people are thinking and what might shape things slightly differently, I would say.
Let me ask you about another challenging project, this one involving an historical retrofit, the Royal Academy. Now, as I understand this, and people in this room will know this project much better than me, so forgive me, but I believe it is actually two buildings, the Burlington House and the Victorian Galleries.
It is.
So how did you approach the retrofit for these buildings, and what were the parameters of preservation of the kinds of things you had to keep in mind for these buildings within this building?
Well, again, it was a slightly invent-your-own project. So, I mean, I was a kid at the time. I have to say, I'm not that old, but I was the year-out student, and that was the first project I ever was engaged with. But to the point where I did 2 years out because it was turning into a very a rich and productive experience. So it's exactly like the British Museum. It's about taking a lost space, a space where people didn't even realise there was a building waiting to happen, and turning it into something, you know, rich, amazing, and making a very bold statement. And again, you can go around a building and people don't see what you know, or vice versa. People see what you don't see, they see something you don't. That's where the whole conversation starts. And that was just a gap filled with lavatories between two buildings. And it was pretty miserable and grim. And probably no one thought, well, actually, we can turn this into something really special. We can put a Michelangelo at the top. We can do all these things. And it's an emerging thing. Very, very rarely, in my experience, does the thing start right, you know, it's not something that forms on day one and then you just work with it. It really emerges over a process.
I still have to imagine that must have, you know, caused some concerns when you showed up and said, we need to take down these walls and figure out what's behind here. You know, what did you see that made you think that there is something to be subtracted in order to come to this project?
Well, again, you're given a puzzle, you're given a challenge. Yeah. We need to sort out X, Y, and Z. And rather than and I always encourage clients, rather than give me the answer, tell me what you're trying to achieve, and we'll go away and maybe collectively, individually, initially, maybe we'll come back together. But tell me what you're trying to achieve, and then we'll go away and try and think about the best way to do it. So there's nothing worse than somebody coming to you and saying, well, this is it. This is what I want to do, and that's it. You know, okay, you're giving me the answer. Tell me what you want to achieve, because people don't always understand the art of the possible. And so I think that's a classic case. There was circulation to address. There were all these various issues, and nobody probably in the Royal Academy had any instinct to say, actually, what we should do is take out all this low-grade stuff, do a few microsurgeries through the building, and look what you get. And so, you know, that's why I encourage everybody to keep an open mind, think about what you need and want rather than what the answer is, and let's see how we get there. And that's when the dialogue starts. I really feel like I'm banging on about dialogue a lot, but to me it's essential. There's no other way to produce good design other than as a collaborative exchange.
Are all your clients so magical? Because it sounds like you have some good luck.
I've had a lot of good luck, but again, it's a relationship. These projects last a long time, and clearly, if you don't see eye to eye, it's not going to be the most productive experience. But no, clients, some are less open-minded than others. Let's put it that way, and I think that's often the challenge, which is. It goes a bit back to like, well, this is the answer rather than this is what I want to try and do. And then I think you don't get the best out of us if you don't open your mind a bit to what you perhaps had never imagined.
We'll ask you to name names once we have drinks in hand. I've banged on for a minute, but I'll ask a question that we've gotten from the audience here, and it's about technology. Given that a lot of your career has been focused on these kind of cultural amenities, how has technology changed your approach to the work that you do with these projects?
In different levels, in different ways. So I would say you can be the best architect designer in the world, but if you can't communicate your ideas very well, then they're just ideas on a ship. So using technology to be able to communicate in the most appropriate way for any given audience. And that varies significantly from people who are very proficient in three-dimensional things to people who have no proficiency whatsoever. So technology is immensely important for us to be able to communicate what we're trying to talk about with clients and other people, even if it's just members of the public or public bodies or whoever it is. But at the other end of the spectrum, delivering a building like this is a formidable challenge. I mean, the team was a very big, sizable team with huge amount of different disciplines, and to bring something like this together without technology. And I think the British Museum without technology and without the ability to use the latest, greatest, we could never have done it. That roof would not have been possible without, and likewise this building. So using technology then as a design tool, and then at the other end of the spectrum, giving the client at the end of the job a digital twin or whatever you want to call it, but there are lots of different words, giving the client something meaningful at the end of the job that they can then work with. I always liken it to, it's like me handing you the ultimate sports car and saying, can you change the spark plugs on that?
Right.
Probably not.
Probably not.
But if you have the right information, you have the right model, you have something that can lead you, you probably can. So, you give somebody a thoroughbred building, they need to be able to live with it, work with it, own it, all of the things. And that's where technology equally comes in, the ability to hand the client something meaningful at the end, and in fact, I think that's a key to lots of buildings. They're only as good as, once you hand it over, then it needs to be something that is interrogatable and be able to be used properly. Otherwise, it's like having an incredibly powerful car and driving at walking speed. It's not really the point.
Right.
Yeah.
Michael, thanks for speaking with me today. I'll leave off with a question that was posed to the audience. The most iconic building in London. Is it one of those four? St. Paul's, Buckingham Palace, the Shard, the Barbican? Or do you have a fifth to nominate?
I'm very fond of the Barbican, and it would be top of my list.
Yeah.
But I doubt very many,
We're in that minority share at the bottom, I think.
I think there are many iconic buildings, but I'm very fond of the Barbican, let's put it that way.
Okay. Me too. All right, great. Good answer. Thank you so much for having us today.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.